Hello, everybody, and welcome to a series of podcasts that I don't know, may be the most important ones that I do. I want to talk about the problems with the Democratic Party and how they might be able to get back in the majorities and maybe even win back the presidency in 2028, and how they can win back the House and Senate maybe in 2026. Or is that even possible? Um, right now, I think the Democrats are feeling a bit of hope because some of Donald Trump's policies so far have proven to be kind of unpopular, even with the people who supported him. If you look at polls, his popularity numbers have been falling significantly on certain issues and falling a bit overall. And a lot of that is because the policies that he's implemented, like mass deportations of undocumented workers, when he really sort of hinted in the election that he was really going to focus on undocumented criminals. But he's not doing that. He's pretty much rounding up everybody who's undocumented, criminal or not, and some people who actually have legal status in the United States but aren't citizens yet. Been rounding those folks up in a very heavy-handed way, using masked ICE agents who grab people off the street or at their workplaces or at courts and toss them in the back of vans and disappear them. The Supreme Court, for God's sake, has given him the okay to take undocumented immigrants and take them have them deported out of the country, but not to their country of origin, just to any random country, and even stuck in hellhole prisons in other countries who are willing to take them. So that was actually a shocking Supreme Court ruling to me, that they thought that was okay. But apparently they do. So Trump has been doing that. Like, he deported hundreds of Venezuelan migrants to a hellhole prison in El Salvador that has a reputation of no one ever leaves it alive. And significant number of these Venezuelan migrants did not have criminal records. They weren't criminals other than they were here illegally. So that's not really what people signed up for when they, voted for Trump, because they supported, his ideas about arresting undocumented immigrants who were criminals. So Trump has lost a bit of support on that issue. He's building also a lot of new detention centers and standing up a very large ICE police force here in the United States. And some of the prisons he's created here in the U.S., he calls them detention centers, but they're prisons with cages. And some of them, the local ones, like famously Alcatraz, are really hellhole prisons, but here in the United States instead of overseas. So I think the bet is, by doing that, by making conditions of detention here so unpleasant, that he really wants immigrants to self-deport rather than risk being sent to a foreign gulag when they're picked up, or when they're actually picked up and put in local gulags like Alcatraz, that they just say, forget it, I don't want to spend years here. I'll just deport myself. And if they sign a document then indicating their willingness to go back to their home country, then they'll get a ticket and they can get out. So clearly all of this is meant to, plus these, really over-the-top ICE raids and manhandling of people on the streets, really has the effect of, first of all, sending the migrant community underground, but also, in fact, keeping migrants from coming to the U.S. because they hear about these things. They don't want to come, which has made effectively shut the southern border. We're just not getting the flow of people across because people have gotten the message that it's not safe for them to be here. So I guess Trump has fulfilled that promise of shutting down illegal immigration across the southern border. Basically, through terror, he's done that. But he's also, working on getting migrants who are already here and to self-deport, whether they've committed crimes or not. But again, the heavy-handed tactics have proven to be unpopular with the general public because we don't like to see ourselves as that cruel and that evil. Americans like to maintain an image, at least, Americans who still have, a sense of morality like to maintain an image that we're a moral people. And, Trump's heavy-handed tactics sort of belie that image because the tactics are immoral. So he's lost some popularity there. He's lost some popularity economically on the economic front because he hasn't made inflation disappear in his first 6 months, and also he's actually promoted policies that are making inflation worse, like tariffs, most of which haven't been passed through to the consumer yet, but they will be soon, and there's already starting to be upticks in the inflation numbers. So, he promised to end inflation. He's causing inflation. He promised to deport, folks here who are committing crimes, but most of the people he's imprisoning and deporting are actually folks here illegally who have not committed crimes. In some cases, folks who have legal status here who have not committed crimes. So, he's gone back on some promises that he made. He also promised not to involve us in, foreign military entanglements, but, he's done that, like through our bombing of Iran, to help out the Israelis there with, I have to say that neither Bill Clinton nor Barack Obama nor Joe Biden were willing to go that far to bomb Iran, but Trump did it, and so some people like that, but some of his base doesn't, because they were promised less overseas intervention, and they see that as doing more overseas intervention. So, he's in his new tax and budget bill, which basically cuts out Medicaid and food stamps for a lot of needy people in the United States, and uses the money saved through that to fund tax breaks that mostly go to rich folks. Not entirely. Some tax breaks go to middle class, but most of them go to the rich. And so some folks, even on his side of the aisle, don't really like the idea of cutting Medicaid and food stamps to give money to richer people who really don't need the money. So, for these various reasons, Trump has lost some popularity. Lost a little bit of popularity just in the national overall vote, and lost a lot of popularity when you poll on specific issues in certain demographics like young people. So a lot of Democrats are seeing that as, okay, Trump is not as popular as he was. Some of his policies are unpopular, so we're going to win 2026 and we got a shot at 2028 because of his unpopularity. But my feeling is Democrats are counting on an outcome there that is far from guaranteed. And I think to really make that outcome happen, Democrats have to change themselves. They have to change their own party and how they approach things, because the only thing that's polling worse than Trump right now in some of Trump's policies are Democrats and their policies. And a lot of, when you do focus groups, a lot of Trump voters, people who voted for Trump this last election but aren't regular Trump voters, when you do focus groups with them, they say, yeah, I don't like this thing Trump's doing, or I don't like that thing Trump's doing, but they then don't say they're going to vote for a Democrat. In fact, if you ask them, okay, so does that mean you're going to vote for a Democrat in the next election? Most of them say no. So Democrats shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that just because some of the stuff Trump's doing is unpopular, that people are going to vote him out or not vote for people he supports. They still are with, a lot of them are still with him, even though they're a bit disillusioned by some of the things he's done. Also, of course, this recent Epstein file scandal where he had promised for years that when he got in power that he was going to release the Epstein files that show that, you know, Epstein was trafficking young girls to Democrats and feeding their bloodlust to whatever, to young molest young females or you know, sacrifice children or whatever the Q folks happen to believe. You know, a lot of them believe that Epstein was sort of key in that thing, in the trafficking of children to, you know, Democratic pedophiles and to Democrats for sacrificial rituals, etc. And so Trump had promised he was going to, when he got in power, he was going to put people in charge of the FBI and Homeland Security and all that who were going to release these files on Epstein, show that he did traffic to girls to Democrats and Democratic leaders and Democratic celebrities, and that he also he didn't die by suicide in jail. He actually was murdered by Democrats, high-powered Democrats in jail, so that he wouldn't talk during his trial. Spill the beans. But at the last minute, when Trump's minions like Pam Bondi said that they were about to release all this stuff, Pam Bondi says, I have these files on my desk and we're going to release them. And then all of a sudden, she says, there's no lists of clients, no evidence that that Epstein blackmailed anyone, and he died by suicide. And that's it. We're not releasing anything else. So that drove the conspiratorial wing of the MAGA base, Trump's base, really crazy. And they've been sort of going nuts on the internet for the last 10 days because they feel betrayed. Like Trump promised to do this and betrayed him. Now they're wondering, why wouldn't he release the stuff? You know, maybe he's involved in it. And Trump, you know, you could make a case for that. Trump was friends with Epstein for years. And, you know, there's lots of pictures and videos of Trump and Epstein together. So who knows? Personally, if there's more details about the Epstein stuff that you can release without compromising his victims' names, you know, because you don't want to release their names, and you can't. Actually, they were underage, most of them at the time this happened. But if there's a way to, you know, release some more information about it, like how did he get away with this for so long, and why was the first time he got punished for, why was the punishment so light, and, you know, how did he get so rich? You know, I think releasing some of that stuff would be useful, as long as you can do it and still protect the identity of his victims. But in any case, so, you know, Trump's got some little revolts going on his side of the aisle, and again, some of the policies he's pursued successfully have been unpopular. But all of that does not mean that people are going to vote Democratic in the next election or elections after that. So I want to focus first on the problems that Democrats have, and a lot of this comes out in focus groups. Some of it comes out through, you know, polling and general interviews. But some of the problems which have been discussed widely in other sites, so I'm not going to really discuss it too much, but I have them listed up here, these problems for the Democrats. You know, they've in some cases really focused on unpopular positions that not only don't resonate with the heartland of America, but, you know, that people are actively hostile to, like publicly funded gender reassignment, trans athletes. A lot of people have trouble with trans. And, I'll admit that one of those people is me. Not that I want to discriminate against trans folks. I have sympathy for people who feel that their body gender doesn't reflect their mind gender. The way they see themselves, the way they think of themselves, the way they feel inside, their emotions. I have sympathy for that. But I have to admit to some queasiness over the idea of the reassignment surgeries, and even the idea that it's okay for trans athletes to compete as their reassigned gender in sporting events. Personally, that doesn't seem. I mean, maybe it's fair. I can't really speak to knowing, because once you've got the reassignment surgery and have taken the hormones, you could argue that you don't have the same athletic prowess as you did when you were male, for example, if you're male to female. So really, it's not an unfair competition, but I can see why people would think it was. Also, under Biden, the sort of open border policy in the South, nobody really supported that. It was putting a strain on public services in a lot of towns and cities across America, and and I think people were understandably upset by it. So, the Democrats who have supported these things, and have supported even DEI initiatives that a lot of people see as actually a form of reverse discrimination and unfair to whites, basically. And again, I don't really agree with that position, but, I see how people come to it. But anyway, Democrats supporting all of those pretty unpopular positions hurt them in the last election. Trump's best ad in the last election was his anti-trans ad, basically. But it was extremely effective and actually changed some people's minds in voting. And he was able to do that because it was a policy favored by Democrats that was really focused on a very unpopular group and position. So Democrats have, mistakenly, recently focused on the support for a lot of these unpopular positions. They've developed, a lot of liberals, and here I use liberal instead of Democrat, have developed kind of an arrogant, off-putting attitude. They dismiss people who are more conservative, people who are from rural areas. They just sort of dismiss them as rubes and uneducated and, unsophisticated, and, they vote against their interests and all that, which they really are not. Because, sometimes their interests have more to do with social, for them, social and religious ideas and aspects of their lives really are more profound to them than some of the economic stuff. So they're willing to, go against their interests maybe a little bit economically in order to support someone who supports them in their religious beliefs and in their, their social beliefs. So, a lot of Democrats have this, they really don't understand. They're not from these areas. They don't understand these areas and how people feel there. And, so they develop a very arrogant, dismissive attitude, which people from those areas just find really insulting. It's like they're not stupid and they're not going against their true interests when they vote conservative. They're just going against different interests than Democrats think they should go against. Democrats also have a candidate recruitment problem. First of all, they don't have any clear front-running candidates right now in national elections, particularly the presidency. But all the way down the tickets, even to the local levels, they either don't have, in a lot of local elections, like school board and that kind of thing, which are, mayors and that kind of thing, which are important, very, very important locally. They don't even run candidates a lot of times, whereas the Republicans definitely do. And at the higher levels where they do run candidates, a lot of them aren't very good. In fact, when I say not good, I mean they don't speak well. They're not charismatic. They're very, they speak very dogmatic, like a boring professor, or just a boring person. So they have a lot of not great candidates, and nationally they don't have clear front-running candidates, which is a problem. They also have pretty much lost their platform, because their platform used to be focused on a lot of unpopular stuff, and now they realize that stuff was unpopular, so now they don't really have a platform at all. And they can't agree on one. For example, there are Democrats and liberals who really are in support of universal health care, essentially a Medicare for all scheme. And then there are a lot of Democrats who aren't comfortable with that. They don't think we should jump there. They think at best we should do some incremental things like expand Medicaid a bit and expand Obamacare a bit to try to get some kind of healthcare coverage covering everyone, but they're not willing to jump to, and then Medicare for all. Because, there's a lot of, they're worried about the counter arguments and getting a lot of backlash from that. The Republicans call that socialism, and as soon as they do, people are like, I don't want to be socialist, I don't want to be communist. And so the Democrats are afraid to go there, except for Bernie. Now, Bernie's not a Democrat, but he does caucus with them, and Bernie's been saying that for years: Medicare for all, campaign finance reform. He's had very strong opinions about, and very liberal opinions about certain things for a lot of years, but people like Bernie. They like Bernie because all these years he stuck to his guns. He hasn't wavered on his support for what most people would see as the more extreme versions of, left politics. Another problem Democrats have is they don't have clear solutions, even the problems that they've identified, like healthcare. They can't agree on a solution for it. Housing costs, they can't agree on a solution for it. I think there are things they can propose. But one thing, they tend to focus on data, and they tend to focus on, broad policy goals when they do talk about stuff, without focusing on the intermediate term and the near term. Like, what can we do now to make things just a bit better, short of the big policy goal? What can we do now to make things just a bit better? For example, if you have a policy goal of Medicare for all, okay, so that tomorrow we're not going to, even if you get into power, we're not going to get Medicare for all tomorrow. There's going to be too much resistance from whatever part of government you don't control. So is there something we can do in the more immediate term? Well, Obama took a big swing at this. He identified, first of all, a group that was uncovered by insurance, sort of the working lower middle class and poor, and made a pretty big proposal to help them out, that particular group, and included in that proposal something that had really ticked people off for years, which was that he would end the you can refuse people based on pre-existing conditions for insurance. So he ended the pre-existing condition mandate, and that was a huge win and a big selling point for a lot of people because they hated that mandate. So Obama probably did want Medicare for all, but he knew he couldn't get it, so he focused on this particular group of underinsured and a couple of specific policies there that he wanted to rescind and overturn that were very unpopular with people. So here he was taking a popular position on a difficult topic. Another problem Democrats have is they don't have any good party slogans. You can argue whether MAGA is a good party slogan for Republicans. I'd say it's been effective, even though it's totally unoriginal. Make America Great Again, of course, was a slogan of Ronald Reagan back in the 1980s. So Trump just stole that slogan. It's not even original with him, but a lot of people who are alive today don't remember back when Reagan was using it. They're not old enough. So especially for younger folks, it feels new, even though it's actually quite old. But the Democrats don't have any good party slogans at all. And I think that's important. I think branding is important. Tell the public in a few words what you really want to focus on when you get in power. What positive change will you make? And as I said before, they're too focused on the national elections and the gubernatorial elections at state level. A lot of Democrats really ignore elections below governor. And they shouldn't. Local elections are important. They're important they have a real effect on people's lives. Who's in control of the school board, who's in control of the city council, that has real direct effect on folks, on what the priorities are in their towns, things that they see every day. So, Democrats have to refocus. They have to start fielding candidates for local elections and try to promote some front runners for higher level elections that are charismatic to some degree. Also, interestingly, Democrats are seen as fiscally irresponsible, even though you can make an argument that, over the past 25 years, it's Republicans that have been fiscally irresponsible for the most part. For example, when Bill Clinton was president in the mid to late 1990s, the government was running a surplus. We didn't have an annual budget deficit. We had an annual budget surplus. And our ongoing debt load was pretty reasonable back then. I think it was like 30% or 40% of GDP, which is a very reasonable debt load for a country. And we were running budget surpluses most years, which means we actually were decreasing our debt. And then 9/11 happened, and it was George W. Bush who started really running up debts in order to finance wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and his global war on terror. So, he stood up a new federal agency to deal with that, and, we were prosecuting all these military campaigns, and that put us in heavy debt. So we went from budget surpluses under Clinton to serious debts, annual deficits of, $1 trillion or $500 billion a year, while George W. Bush was in office. He was a Republican. Also under George W. Bush, the housing crisis developed. The mortgage-backed securities that weren't really backed by any decent mortgages, and the financial meltdown that came from that really developed under George W. Bush. His presidency was kind of disastrous financially. But one reason Democrats are seen as fiscally responsible is when Bush left office, it was Obama that had to come in and clean up that fiscal mess. The crash of the global financial system. And the only way Obama could see to do that, because his Fed chair, Bernanke, was basically telling him this, was to bail out banks to the tune of trillions of dollars. So they didn't collapse and go under and everybody didn't lose their money. Now, you can argue whether Obama did the right thing or the wrong thing here when it comes to bailing out the banks. But the truth is, he only really had two options: to bail out the banks or to nationalize them, to make them part of the federal government and essentially federalize the whole banking system. Anything else would have led to a situation where the banks would have collapsed one by one, and everybody who had investments in the banks, whether it was a checking account or a savings account or actual private equity investments, everybody would have lost most or all of their money. And that would have led us into a very severe depression, not just in the United States but globally. So I'm not sure Obama really had a choice. I mean, maybe you can argue he should have nationalized the banks rather than bailed them out. I don't think the bailout was a choice, but it did put us into heavy debt. That debt occurred under Obama's watch, so under a Democrat, even though it really developed under Bush, and even before Bush, actually started probably with Clinton. But there is, I think, a clear mistake two clear mistakes that Obama made when he did bail out the banking system. One of them was he didn't put any restrictions on the money that he gave the banks. So a lot of that money was actually used to pay bank CEOs and executives big bonuses for crashing the entire world's economic system. So it didn't help reform the system. It actually just perpetuated the system, and in some ways made it worse. So he should have released that money with conditions, or if the banks weren't willing to accept the conditions, he should have threatened to federalize them, to take them over federally. So that's, I think, a mistake that he made. He also made a mistake in that he didn't prosecute any bankers. So even though there was massive crime, fraud, and malfeasance across all levels of banking in the United States, all the way up to the CEOs and CFOs in every bank, pretty much, and every financial institution, nobody was prosecuted, no one went to jail. Even though these people had ripped off consumers who were buying houses to the tune of trillions and trillions of dollars. So when Obama didn't do that, when he didn't put restrictions on the money, threatened to federalize the banks, prosecute some of the worst of the banking offenders, people got the message. They were like, okay, this is an unfair system. There's one rule for rich people, another rule for people who aren't rich. And that's just the way it is all the way up to the presidency. And that's, I think, when people became extremely disillusioned with the United States, which ultimately led to Trump. I put some of that on Obama. Some of that is on Bush. Some of that is on Clinton for letting that problem develop. But some of that is on Obama for the way he bailed out the banks. I don't necessarily oppose the bailout, but the way he did it was not good. And ultimately led to people becoming so disillusioned with him and with the U.S. system in general, U.S. financial system, that they were willing to take a flyer, and after Obama left office, on a rich guy who, who pretended to be a populist and told everyone he was going to make the lives of the working class better financially. Another bit of fiscal responsibility came with Trump's first tax bill during his first term, Trump version 1. He did pass the original tax bill, which was just extended, which put us back into debt. So Obama had put us into more debt bailing out the banks. Then Trump put us into more debt with his huge tax breaks for rich people and businesses. And then Biden came in the middle of a pandemic, and he put us into more debt, actually doing something that I really supported, which was giving just money to people who were out of work during the pandemic, because the pandemic threw a lot of people out of work. The unemployment rate went up significantly, and also the costs of things went up significantly because the supply chains were disrupted by the pandemic. For example, the factories in China that had been running and churning out huge amounts of cheap goods for us, they stopped running because the factories shut down in China, the manufacturing shut down in China in order to keep people from getting infected with COVID. And so all of a sudden our supply chains were disrupted. All the stuff we got from China couldn't get anymore, including masks for self-protection. And so we started having shortages of things, and that led to price spikes for things, basic necessities, even like toilet paper. And so Biden responded to that. He couldn't do a lot about the factories closed in China, but he responded to that by just sending people government checks, giving them extra money to tide them through these tough times when they were out of work, to give them more money to pay for higher prices on things they bought every day. He also suspended repayment on student loans, which is a big financial burden for a lot of young people. And even talked about forgiving certain amounts of student loans during that time, which proved to be not as popular an idea, but people certainly appreciated the direct checks. The only problem is those direct checks to everybody in the United States basically put us huge trillions of dollars. They cost the government trillions of dollars and put us in big annual debt and deficit. Really increased the ongoing debt of the U.S. and very much increased the annual deficits. So we had to increase the deficit to deal with COVID. And that was under Biden. And also all that forgiveness, loan forgiveness, and extra money people spent, and it led to accelerating inflation. Part of the inflation was due to supply shortages from COVID. Part of it was due to the bailout of just regular folks. So I admire Biden's heart in doing what he did. I think he had a good heart and his intentions were very good. And it was helpful for people to get that money when they needed it. But it did have the knock-on effect of accelerating inflation more than just the inflation from the pandemic. And so when inflation was all of a sudden up around 10% for everything from household goods to groceries to housing, that became a real problem for people. A very big problem for people. So they got mad, and they voted out Biden and got Trump back, and now Trump has just passed another generous tax bill, which is going to put us further in debt. Plus, he's pursued a weird policy of global tariffs, which is going to ultimately increase inflation, because our businesses are the ones that pay for those tariffs, and they are going to at least pass on some of the costs, the extra costs, to consumers. So consumer goods are going to go up in price. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying that basically no one's been fiscally responsible, you can argue, since Bill Clinton was president. Democrats, Republicans, in the case of the Democrats, though, they were responding to a crisis that had developed before they took office. Like COVID developed during the Trump presidency, first Trump presidency, and the housing crisis really developed during during the Bush Jr. presidency, though a little bit from the Clinton presidency. But it was, in both those cases, Democrats who won the elections where they had to fix the problem, which involved throwing a lot of money at it and putting us in further debt. So even though Republicans have been equally irresponsible as Democrats, and you can argue more so, because in a lot of cases they let problems develop, the Democrats are seen as fiscally irresponsible, and they have to address that. They have to prove to people who they want to vote for them that they're not going to get saddled again with runaway Biden inflation or runaway Obama-like giveaways to banks if they do vote for Democrats again. So bottom line is Democrats have important image problems. They have candidate problems. They have slogan problems. They have policy problems. So just because Trump has lost some of his popularity does not mean that the folks who are disillusioned with Trump are going to just vote Democratic. In most cases, they almost certainly will not. So Democrats are no more guaranteed to win upcoming elections than they were in the last election. Really. Maybe slightly more. They have a little bit more of a chance, but I would say still an uphill battle here. So in the next video, I think we'll talk about some of the solutions to these problems. Some of them are pretty obvious, like coming up with some good slogans, but I like to go in depth on some of the solutions to the democratic problems and a way they really need to shift their attitudes and the way they speak out loud and speak to people if they really want to win back some folks. And then we can also, when we talk about solutions, talk about who it is Democrats want to win back and how they plan to do that. Okay, so I'll see you in video 2.